It won't surprise many of you, that's one of my favorites. Good morning. It is nice to be with you all again in this place and in this place. I'm glad to be here. This morning, our scripture comes from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." I don't know about you, but when I think of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, there are a few minor details that I might leave out if someone were to ask me to recite it. So I'll admit here today that I know that this story is in all 4 of the Gospels, but I often forget about the little boy in the Gospel of John. This child only appears in John's story, so I'm sure we could have a lengthy conversation about his role in this event. Nonetheless, he is important to John's author and is the one to provide the bread and fish. I also tend to forget that it was Jesus who asked how they were going to feed all of these people. Sometimes the disciples are not very bright. Or rather, the disciples have to learn along the way. We already have the answers from the back of the book, but for them, Jesus is usually the one with all the answers. He is revealing himself and his mystery to them as the story progresses. But in this story, instead of providing the answers, Jesus is asking the question. As the disciples discuss the answer, they're doing some problem solving. I'm picturing, when a family goes on a picnic and they tell their only child they can invite one friend, but instead they invite one group of friends. Now, how can they feed everyone with just 3 sandwiches and a bag of chips? Well, we could cut them in half and share, or we could just have the chips and let the kids have the sandwiches. The disciples are trying to figure it out. Then along comes this young boy who has all that they need. It turns out that the friend group brought their own food. How many times do we forget to ask the question? We don't know the end of the story for our own journey. And as a church, our story is still unwritten. So, unlike Jesus, we don't know where we are going or what the Spirit has in store for us. What questions should we be asking to allow our story to unfold with the mystery of God in tow? What questions do you have that have gone unasked? There is so much to learn, and we keep ourselves from engaging by not taking the risk to ask the question. Or maybe we assume the answer so we don't bother to ask. Sometimes we don't ask the question because we're afraid of the answer. I remember when I was in high school, I worked at an ice cream shop. We were intensely taught how to upsell. The person who had come to train us from corporate always said, if you don't ask, they can't say yes. It was so annoying sometimes. But when I put the asking into practice, I was shocked how many people took me up on my offer to make it a double today, or have a waffle cone with that. I also thought of this when I worked our concession stand at PNC on Friday night. When I would say, would you like something else? They would say, oh yeah, I'd also like a bottle of water. But if I just gave them their total, our transaction ended. I think in church we have a complicated relationship with questions. As we grow up, we have to learn that questioning faith is indeed part of life, and it hopefully makes you stronger. That somehow being willing to question means that we are weaker or we don't have faith. But all told, the ability to ask questions and seek deeper meaning might make our faith more rewarding and richer. Even if we come up with the same understanding, at least we took the time to investigate the theological issue. We feel like we're supposed to have the answer, both for our faith and for our interactions of faith with others. Diane and Amanda just did a sermon series all about the cliche things people say to others during hard times. I think that it's a product of being afraid of asking others how they really feel. Looking back, I find it interesting that in all of my pastoral care training and in all of my time as a chaplain, we were taught and encouraged to ask questions instead of making statements. It leaves room to learn what is important for the person in front of us, instead of closing that space between us with facts or uncomfortable statements. Questions leave room for mystery and surprise that we didn't know was there. When Ben and I, my husband and I, first met, we were virtual strangers. We had little shared experience, no friends in common. So we took the first summer of our relationship to ask questions. We bought a book called The If Book, full of if questions, and we went cover to cover, reading all of the questions to one another and answering them. We learned a lot from that book. We also had some serious conversations from our answers from the book. Based on our answers, we were able to engage and learn with one another. Sometimes when it was my turn to read the questions when he was driving on a long trip, I'd find myself getting nervous or uncomfortable about some of the more vulnerable questions that the book posed. So on this Consecration Sunday, I encourage us to think about the questions. To think about the questions that we need to be asking. Questions that need to be addressed within ourselves, within our families, and our community here at St. Paul's. As we look for congregational leaders and we support our ministers and our staff, where do we see ourselves investing in the questions of St. Paul's? Are there questions we need to ask that we shy away from? Jesus asked, how are we going to feed all of these people? We ask that question every month and fill Tom Law's trunk to the brim for those in our community. Today I ask, how are you being fed? Are you being fed? As a community, I pray that each of us feels that we are spiritually fed and excited about the Spirit that fills this place. How can we feed your spirit? Is there an interest that you have that isn't represented here? How can we feed your spirit? Do you have an idea for a fundraiser or some other activity that better speaks to your skills and your talents? How can we feed your spirit? In my humble opinion on this Consecration Sunday, I also want us to ask, how can we be the spirit of the church? Giving of ourselves to our community is important so that we can hold each other up in times of great celebration and deep grief. In order to do that, we must be invested in our ability to give of time, of talents, and yes, of money. Today, I could have shared the story of the 5 loaves and fishes that fed the masses because with Christ, there is always enough. And in many ways, that is so true. But if we're honest about the world that we live in and the reality that we're a part of, there are also many ways that there just isn't enough. Whether it's not enough volunteers, time, money, or interest, there are times that we come up short. That doesn't mean that God isn't providing and that God isn't alive in this place. Because I truly believe that the Spirit of God is alive and well in St. Paul's. I see that in the laughter and the fellowship that we share, and in the difficult times when folks rally around one another. I see that in the genuine joy that someone exudes as they watch our youth share their unique talents. I see the Spirit of God in the way that we hike, the way we work for Habitat, and the way that we come together in a concession stand at PNC Arena. God is alive at St. Paul's, but I wonder about the questions that go unasked, the ideas that never get shared, the talents that are hidden within us. How can we ask the right questions to live fully into our identity as St. Paul's? How can we invest in our church and the story of God that is unfolding in our community? I pray that we will invest in all the many ways that we can make St. Paul's the fullest version of itself, that feeds the spirits of those in these pews and the people that we haven't even met yet. If you are interested in joining St. Paul's and its journey to live out God's call, please speak with Diane and Amanda or join them at the front of the congregation as we sing our hymn of invitation on page 606.